You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Hahn,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
Well, thanks for joining me again today for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Jacqueline Friedland on the show with me today. She's got a phenomenal new book. It's called That's Not a Thing, and this is definitely needs to be on your summer to be read list. Welcome to the show, Jackie.
Hi, Hank. Thanks so much for having me.
You're so welcome. I'm excited to have you today. Jackie, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Wow. It's hard to distill it down to just one, but I would say that back when I was in later elementary school, sort of fourth and fifth grade, my friends would come to me whenever we had an assignment at school to do a book report or a creative writing assignment. And they would all say, Jackie, I need your help. Jackie, you're so good at this. Jackie, talk to me. And I was a child who wasn't particularly good at sports, was not particularly social at that time of my life. And it was all of a sudden there was something I was good at that people were telling me I was good at. And I just thought, wow, this is like super great, and realized that writing was really a part of who I am. But I must add that as much as I loved writing stories and being a storyteller, I also didn't appreciate that it might be a career I could pursue until much, much later in life. At that point in time, it sort of seemed like becoming a movie star or, a rock star, like super cool, but probably not going to happen for me.
Like that it happens because you see people out there that it's happened to, but it doesn't seem like regular people can attain that. It's kind of one of those feelings.
Right, exactly. Sort of like winning the lottery. It happens,
right.
But obviously it won't happen to me.
I love to ask those questions because I love to see how those early influences and those early feelings kind of follow us through life. And and anyone who gets early encouragement like that, there's some pretty dark days for writers. We spend a lot of time by ourselves in a room alone, making up stories. And a lot of times it's those early encouragements that we pull back on and kind of feed the desire to do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I actually had, when I was getting my master's in creative writing, the director of the program and I were chatting one day, and he said to me, you're only as good as the last thing you've written, and the stress is going to keep on coming. And it's sort of what you just said, and it's true.
That's so funny. So as someone who appreciated creative writing or storytelling, but didn't necessarily think that it was something that was attainable, what did you pour your passion into?
Well, certainly reading, which has been, a joy for my entire life. And when I was in high school in those years, I was big into painting and art. And then I got to college and I started, I majored in English, and I was taking all of these, courses where you're doing analytical essays and pulling apart other people's writing. So I finally took a creative writing class, and it was super fun. But it didn't feel like school, because there weren't clear steps to follow and a clear structure the way there are in so many other classes. So it almost felt like I was getting away with something by getting to take creative writing, which I only did twice throughout all of college, because I felt like, well, I better, focus on more rigorous subjects. And when I finished college, I didn't know what to do with myself and ended up going to law school, but not because of passion, more because of, I suppose the passion was that I like to work hard and I wanted to be successful, but it was not because of any passion for the law.
So, what was it about the law that drew you in there? Was it just a chance to kind of work with the skills that you had? What if it was something that you were not passionate about? What drew you there?
A couple of things. One, I had no better ideas. Two, I was advised by several people I trusted, including my mother and my favorite faculty advisor, that pursuing a career, I thought at the time maybe I should be an English professor at the college level and I should pursue a PhD in English. And I was advised that it would be a tremendous amount of work, followed up by limited jobs and minimal pay. And if there was anything else that I thought I might possibly want to do, I should explore it. And my feeling at the time was I love English and books and writing so much that if I try, say, law and it doesn't work out, there's a high chance I would go back to something in the literary world versus if I start out with writing and the attendant possibilities and it doesn't work out, I will never go back to law school in my 30s or 40s, et cetera. And the other thing was that I believed at the time that if I went to law school, that I didn't necessarily have to be a lawyer, that I might use that education in some other capacity. But once I got to law school, they make it very easy for you to follow the traditional path and just end up at a big corporate law firm, which is exactly what I did and completely not where I belonged.
What was it about that atmosphere that you didn't quite fit in?
I always say I felt like I was playing dress up, like a little kid who was like, I'm going to pretend to go to work today. And I would show up in the office and I just didn't feel a connection to what I was working on. I couldn't get fired up about, and perhaps the cases I worked on were particularly boring, but I was representing one company where the people who make the top of a canned good, like a can of straight green beans, for example, the top is made by one company and the body of the can is made by another. And they were in a lawsuit with each other about some goods that had gone bad and whose fault it was. And I found that, horribly boring and working these incredible hours. And, it's all about like, well, did the pop top, was it faulty or was it not? And, it's just, and how many cans of corn, et cetera, had to be wasted. And it just, after months and hours, and, I can't even tell you how much time I spent on these cases. And also I was at a very big firm and I don't know, I just felt very anonymous. And my main priority was to get work done in a way that would allow me to leave the office by 8 p.m. And if I could do that, I felt good about my day, which meant to me that I really shouldn't be feeling good about the job.
Wow. I had no idea that the tops of cans came from a different place than the body of the can. That's insane.
Right.
Things you only learn on this podcast. But that can be kind of soul crushing work, can it? When it's something you're not passionate about and you feel like the wheels are just turning and did you ever find yourself longing, what if I could be a writer? I know that people are writing books out there. I know that people with regular lives are writing books. Why can't that be me? Did you have one of those feelings?
For sure. What happened was when I was actually working as a lawyer, I started in my time off on the weekends, et cetera, reading a lot of fiction. And I previously had always been sort of reading the classics and the kind of books you'd read in school. And once I began reading more on my own outside of school, I picked up a lot of women's fiction, a lot of books that I'd never been exposed to before. And I felt like when I encountered books by people like Emily Giffin and Jennifer Weiner and a few others, sort of like, wow, I could do this, maybe not. I think they're wonderful writers and I'm not saying I'm as good as they are, but I felt like it was a genre that I could become a part of. And so I was recently married and just had decided to become pregnant with my first child and decided that I was going to use maternity leave and write a book and make that my escape path from the law, which is not exactly how things panned out, but it was a bold plan.
So that's very interesting. So did you have the desire to write and the desire to get out of law or was there a story idea, or was there both? Did the desire to be a writer come before the idea for a story, or had you had this idea rolling around and this was the opportune time to pursue it?
I definitely, the desire to be a writer preceded the actual story. And then after that, I began struggling. Well, what am I going to write about? I was like 24 or 25 at the time, and I sort of felt like I'm still really young and I haven't had all this life experience and I have to come up with a story. But then once I sort of sat and really focused, I realized that I was a huge historical fiction fan at the time, and I decided I was just going to look to history and find an era that spoke to me. And once I did that and started my research, it was like there were lots to choose from.
So your first book that you published, Trouble the Water, is that a Regency period story?
It's antebellum South, so
Okay,
in Victorian times.
gotcha. What was this the story that started kind of working through your mind?
Yes, yes. I've always been intrigued by the American South before the Civil War and the way that you had these Southern belles in their bright colors and their opulent parties and so much excess juxtaposed with the life of the slaves who had the exact opposite and such hard lives, and how our society ever functioned like that. It still boggles my mind. So I can just read and read and read the research for hours, which is how I began my journey. And then this whole story of an abolitionist and the woman who he meets grew out of that.
So Jackie, as you started pursuing this idea and started getting this story thread in your mind, as you started writing the story, what was the thing that surprised you the most about, being a book lover, being a lover of storytelling, and then having a long form story like this that you were writing for yourself? What part of the process surprised you, or did it just come organically and just feel natural?
Wow, I think it all surprised me. At the time that I began, I felt very confident in my ability to write, a great paragraph, a great chapter even. And I remember saying to my husband at the time, when I write an essay, I agonize over every sentence, but with a whole book, you can't possibly agonize over every sentence. So turns out you can and you must. And, and
Yes, you can.
I think that at the beginning, I thought if I just get something written down, it will be good enough. And that was not the case. And which is part of why that book took me almost 10 years to write. I wrote it and then I rewrote it and then I put it away. And then I actually rewrote it from page one a final time before I got the final version.
So your plan to use maternity leave to write a book and launch your author career, what happened with that desire?
Well, my son, who's now 16, was a very demanding baby, as I think most are. He liked to, he would cry every time you put him down, which didn't really lend itself to writing a book in 3 months. So I did manage to use a little bit of the time to start researching and to start dreaming up plots. And I then went back to work, and I had already, I knew that I had failed at the 3-month goal, but I had succeeded in that I had lit a fire under myself to try this and to make a go of it. And so I didn't feel I was in the don't quit your day job mode and didn't want to leave until I really felt like I had some substance to grab onto. So every opportunity I had, when he slept at night, when the weekends came, I was writing. And eventually, over a period of years, I had this messy draft. And I said, like, okay, now I've put in the time to write this messy draft. Now I'm going to do it better. And I think it was the more time I committed to it, the more committed to the idea I became. It was sort of like a cycle, if that makes sense.
There's something really interesting that happens, Jackie, in a person's mind, that one moment you can imagine yourself writing a book, and you think of what future you might look like, And then you actually start the process, and there's like a switch that flips in your brain or something that you go from someone who might like to do this one day to I am a writer. I may not have published anything yet. I may not have a book on the shelves that people can go buy, but there's a switch that flips where you become the thing that you have dreamed of being.
That's true. That's true. Although I have to admit that when I was working on this book, I felt very shy about it and really
Sure.
want to talk about it. I mean, I feel like there's so many people, who are working on their novel and nothing ever comes to pass. And I didn't want to be one of those people. So even when I went back to school, I didn't mention to many friends where I was spending my day. It didn't come up. And so I didn't mention it.
Right.
And then when I actually published the first book, so many friends, like people who are like pretty involved in my lives, were like, what? Where did this come from? I had no idea.
That's so amazing. So you eventually finished this book. Did when you typed the end or of that final draft, had something changed inside you from that person 10 years prior that had that really wanted to do this? Now you've completed this. How did you feel about yourself, and what did you do to get the book out to the world?
Wow. Well, I definitely felt somewhat proud, somewhat nervous. I think I learned a lot writing the first book, and I also became very attached to my characters. So it was almost bittersweet when I knew I was finished with it because I sort of had to let them go. But I also writing has always been a part of my identity, and by the time I finished this book, it was such a part of who I am and who I had become that I just knew I had to get it out there. And so the way that I did that was I started querying agents, and as the process was unfolding and I was getting responses saying, yes, this sounds interesting, please send me the first chapter or the first half, etc. I met another writer named Susie Schnall, who lives not far from me. And she told me that she was using a publisher, a small press called She Writes Press. And I just looked them up on the internet and saw that you could submit directly to them without an agent. So I figured, why not try that? And they got back to me very quickly telling me it was a little too long, but if I cut down, I think it was 27,000 words I had to get rid of, they would be happy to publish it. So rather than endure the ongoing wait and torture of trying to find an agent, I said, you know what, let's do it. And I haven't looked back for a second. They've been wonderful to work with. And I've been thrilled with them.
So after launching that book, there's kind of a weird thing that happens when this book is out in the world and you're doing promotion for it and it feels like such an accomplishment, and then this little thing starts nagging you again, and it's that second book. Um, Tell me about the genesis of That's Not a Thing, because this book is very different from the first one. It's set in modern times. What was the kernel of the idea that began to grow into this thing?
So I have to start by saying that I think a contemporary voice, that the voice and That's Not a Thing is sort of my default writing voice. It comes out of me much more easily than the historical fiction voice. So I wanted to try something contemporary now that I felt I had, a little bit of, I had learned enough to kind of dabble into, like, to take my first foray into the contemporary world. And the kernel of the story is that when I was a little girl, I learned that my mother had been engaged before she met my father. And that engagement ended 3 weeks before the wedding. And the man to whom she'd been engaged was her high school sweetheart. And he was described to me, I sort of, as a little girl, I kind of pictured a Ken doll, but, very perfect, like real high school sweethearts. He'd come pick her up in his red convertible back in I guess it was like late 50s, early 60s. And they dated all through college. And it really sounded like this golden glow of a romance. And a few weeks before the wedding, the groom's parents decided to take a vacation to de-stress from all of the strife of the wedding planning and having to negotiate various details between the families. And they were going, I think, to St. Martin or St. Bart's, some fabulous Caribbean island, and they were on a little plane, and the plane crashed into the ocean on the way to the island. And
Oh my
amazingly,
goodness.
several people on the plane survived, but his father passed away because he was not wearing his seatbelt and he hit his head. And he blamed my mother and her family for his father's death. And they sort of reached a place that they couldn't get back from. And so just 3 weeks before the wedding, they broke everything off. And I always I think they never really had closure. And I always this story, you grow up hearing this, and it wasn't something that was talked about a lot, but I always just wondered, like, what happened? Like, maybe that was the guy she was meant to be with, especially because my own parents ended up getting divorced when I left for college. I really felt like, well, maybe she missed the path that she was supposed to take. And so that was the kernel of my story, with my mother's permission. And I, from there, dreamt up this whole modern story of, a young woman in college who meets the guy who really she thinks is the man for her. And they have a similar fallout around the wedding planning. And then he comes back into her life later, and what happens? It was sort of what I always wondered, what would have happened had that happened to my mother.
That's some pretty intense what if scenarios to start playing with.
Yes.
So going from those kind of instigating factors to then dreaming up, how can I take some of these feelings, if nothing else, kind of the tone of what that experience was like, and juxtaposing those on modern characters. Tell me about Meredith Altman. Where does she come from, and how does she factor into these things that you were thinking about?
So Meredith Altman she is a young woman, overachiever, serious student, who at some point in the book, somebody calls her a savior of widows and orphans. She's like, she's a real do-gooder because she knows that she has several character flaws. She knows she can be self-involved. She knows she can be, a little too greedy in her life, both emotionally and, in terms of possessions. And she really wants to make the world a better place to offset what she knows are her imperfections. And when she meets Wesley, who is the guy that she meets in college, she's going through a rough time at home. Her mother has cancer, and it seems her parents may be getting divorced. And she all of a sudden has this one bright spot in her life, and she begins to compartmentalize. In 1 minute she's at Sloan Kettering visiting her mother, and she's the sympathetic daughter and sort of devastated preemptively about her mother. And then she goes back to college, and she's the fun college girl, and she's fitting into that role, pushing away all of the emotions about her parents in those moments. And as she and Wesley have their enormous breakup and she moves on in life, she sort of maintains those characteristics and has to struggle with sort of, she's an adult now, and how does she grow up, and how does she reconcile her need to help the world with the fact that she has now sold out and she's working at a big New York corporate law firm, and feeling that she is not fulfilling the goals that she once had for herself. And I will say that as a former attorney, I did have a lot of fun poking fun at the drudgery of junior attorneys and the document review and the overbearing senior attorneys. And that was sort of, I was laughing my way through those scenes.
There was a movie called Finding Forrester with Sean Connery. It came out over a decade ago, maybe a decade and a half or so. And anyway, Sean Connery plays this reclusive writer who had a spectacular career long ago and then became a recluse. And he meets this young man through strange circumstances at first, but he wants to also become a writer. And one thing that he teaches the young man is to start put paper in the typewriter and start typing one of Sean Connery's old stories until the words of his own flowed and the story became something new to him. Begin with something that's familiar and let it evolve into that. As you're thinking through the story, maybe even started writing it, at what point did your thought processes leave your mother's old situation and the thing that she went through, and even your um, situations with being a young attorney, and when did it start evolving into new characters with a story of their own?
That is a good question. I think that as before I start writing any book, I sort of do like a riff on each character where I'll write several pages, almost stream of consciousness about who that person is, what foods they like, their favorite childhood memory, where they've gone on vacation, hobbies, anything, just so I can really kind of get to know them. And once I had done that for my characters, they became people to me. And I think that I always say my best days writing are when I kind of put my hands on the keyboard and it's like I'm just watching scenes unfold and I don't even feel like I'm struggling. Like it doesn't feel like it's coming from me. It feels like I'm a spectator. And I think that happened for me pretty early on in this book. So it's almost like, I almost feel like, wow, what a coincidence that this engagement ended the same way my mother's did, because it felt new for me pretty much from the beginning.
That's amazing. So, as you started um, thinking through these characters, one of the characters, Wesley, has ALS, and that becomes kind of a plot point. Did you know anything about ALS going into this, and how did this kind of life altering event for him change the trajectory of the story?
So no, I'm lucky that I don't have anyone in my life who has ALS, but I do have family who have suffered from chronic illness, and so I'm familiar with what it's like to feel that sort of helpless, caretaker vibe. And also I've witnessed, how the victim of these illnesses kind of will struggle with them. And I wanted to use ALS in particular because it's just the idea of a person suffering, their body deteriorating around a brain that's still completely functioning in terms on a cognitive level is it's so devastating for the families and for the person who's suffering from it. And I knew I obviously on some level it was a device to create an obstacle. And I figured as long as I was employing that device, I wanted to use something to do it in a way that would bring awareness to something important. And you remember a few years ago, there was that ice bucket challenge that went
Sure.
viral. And so that was great. That brought all this awareness about ALS, and all of a sudden people were talking about it. And at least from where I sit, it kind of disappeared after a while. And it was like, oh, that was that ALS thing. And now that's over. So I felt it was a good opportunity to bring awareness back about ALS. And as far as changing the trajectory of the story, I think it was sort of what I was talking about earlier about how I had this kind of little girl's fairy tale in my head about what might have happened had my mother's experience, had she had an opportunity to explore her relationship with her ex-fiance further. I think that my adult consciousness tells me that there are always stumbling blocks and there are always obstacles that come up. And so I felt it added an element of reality to, things don't just work out. If you go down path A, it's not all going to be, snowflakes and roses, and path B, something else. So I just wanted to inject that, for lack of a better way to say it, the struggle is real, right?
What comparing this book to your first book, and the first book being in historical fiction, and then That's Not a Thing being set, in current times, were there challenges in writing the two different types of stories, other than, in historical fiction, you need to do your research and make sure that you put things in the right place and in the right time?
It was when I started That's Not a Thing, I was all excited that, oh, now I'm not going to have to do research. Hooray. Because I had spent so many hours researching for Trouble the Water. And it turns out I was wrong. As my characters developed illnesses, for example, and, there I was on the phone with doctors and back on the internet and back in the books. So there definitely was research, although I do allow that it was less research than for Trouble the Water. And the other thing that I thought was, I thought that it would be easier, which nothing is ever easy. Because in historical fiction, it's hard because you can't, those places and those times, they obviously do not exist anymore. But with contemporary fiction, people have been to all the places you're describing, and they'll know if there's errors, and it's like they can almost picture themselves there. And so you have to really get it right in terms of not just your own characters, but the entire vibe of the physical location and, just setting, etc. And then on top of that, without the sort of complicating factor of history as a backdrop, I think people are sometimes able to focus on the emotions more than they might in a historical fiction book. So there's also that element of really making sure you your readers can connect with the emotions of the characters. So I would say they were equally challenging, but very different experiences.
Well, the new book is called That's Not a Thing. It's available everywhere now where you buy books. It's you can get it in a physical copy or Kindle edition, and there's going to be links to it in the show notes where you can find it easily. Jackie, if people are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you do, where can they find you online?
Lots of places. They can find me. My website is JacquelineFriedland.com, or I'm on Instagram as Jackie Friedland, and I'm on Twitter as JB Friedland, or Facebook. I'm there too, Jacqueline Friedland, author.
And we'll round up all of those links and put them in the show notes so that people can easily find you and get in touch with you. Jackie, this has been so much fun chatting. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Great.